now might just be able to talk to you and give you a picture while he's talking, a moving motion picture, or something even more profound. Maybe some sort of auditory music component going along with it to set the tone. All of these things are possible with technology. Is that where we're going? Is that what we need to do good communication, or are we just looking at an advanced vocabulary?
I'm still wondering if technology is here as something that will stay, or is it just some kind of metaphor for something we lost a long time ago, you know? Maybe we're able to do all this stuff without the technology we're using right now, but we just forgot how to. I mean, ever since you said that thing about imagining your hands, I'm seeing things move, or maybe you're doing it with your mind and your hand is not real. You know, it's not something I would just discard right away. And maybe it's just something we forgot that we're doing, and we created some kind of illusion for ourselves to make us understand stuff better. I mean,
yeah.
Nobody knows what's coming. I mean, it's going so fast. If you would today suggest something something that is normal today was unthinkable, maybe even 10 or 15 years ago. Who knows where we're going?
Yeah, that's a good point. He's talking about when I mentioned René Descartes, and I don't remember all the details about him. I studied him fairly heavily in college for a big report me and another guy had to write, but basically Descartes had closed himself up in a room to do some thinking experiments, and he convinced himself at one point that his hands did not exist, and that his mind drew in the hands to make sense of the stuff he was moving around using only his mind. And what it was at that point, think about it, you and I can imagine that today, RD, but in his time, that was incredibly, phenomenally far outside the box. Very brave thinking to almost talk oneself into insane thoughts, which may have been perfectly sane. But the way we define sanity, it would have been seen by everyone else at the time as insane, the way he was behaving and thinking. But that's how discoveries are made. And maybe you're right. Maybe all of this is imagined. Maybe most of it's imagined. But I heard somebody do a TED Talk the other day, and I'm curious what you think about this, that said he could prove 99.99% that we were a simulation just based on the likelihood that we were a simulation. What do you think about that? You think it's possible we're all just a simulation running on some computer somewhere?
Well, this is not a good day to ask me that, because I'm all into the supercomputer today. No, but I think I mentioned in the chat before on one of your shows, must have been like 10, 20 shows ago, but when you were talking about virtual reality, that if you can picture it in the future, who says we're not already in it? We wouldn't realize it. If you can kind of if you now can say that in 20 or 30 years from now virtual reality will probably be as good as real as reality, then you can't rule out the possibility that you're already in it. I mean,
right.
That's the same, and it's the same with time travel. I mean, if we invent time travel in the future, those guys would already be here, right? I mean,
right.
Fucking with us.
Unless this is our first time through this moment. That's the only possibility, is that, here's what I think. I think that deja vu, this is a possibility, it's just something I probe with, like deja vu might be whenever somebody passes into your time zone or through it, it's not the first time you've lived that moment. So you feel it all over again, but you don't know why. But maybe this is the first time through, so maybe we haven't invented time travel yet, but what's the likelihood that this is our first time through the year 2015 and that the future hasn't happened already with time travel being invented, and every time somebody passes into or through our time, we relive some of these moments?
Yeah, I don't know if there is even a first time. Maybe it's just an infinite loop. I don't know. I would never... That's the thing. I want to be able to claim these things without science telling me that it's not possible, you know, because science has limited thought before that after a certain period became possible after all. But I don't want to rule out possibility just because we haven't figured it out yet, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you. And that also speaks to something Terrance McKenna said. I've got a quote up here. He said, "The alternative physics is a physics of light. Light is composed of photons which have no antiparticle." This means that there is no dualism in the world of light. The conventions of relativity say that time slows down as one approaches the speed of light. But if one tries to imagine the point of view of a thing made of light, one must realize that what is never mentioned is that if one moves at the speed of light, there is no time whatsoever. There is an experience of time zero. And I find that interesting because if you look at any object that was going into a black hole, if you could see it, it would freeze. And that makes sense. Time must stop right as it goes into a black hole because gravity is so intense and time and gravity are interconnected. So if time is so easily manipulated by nothing more complex than gravity, you can imagine that even if it's not us, maybe some species from across the universe, certainly somebody has figured out how to manipulate time to their benefit.
Yeah, or maybe we're just inside an organism that regulates itself, you know? I mean, something can be self-regulatory. You'd expect something higher to be controlling everything because it's so hard to imagine that there's nobody behind the scenes, you know? I mean,
yeah.
At least for me it is, but that's why it's so. I always get disappointed when people knock religion because you're kind of throwing out a lot of people that have interesting ideas about not organized religion, but just thinking about what is in this universe. You know, I have no trouble listening to religious people as long as they don't take the Bible literally, and as they can. For example, if people speak about God, I often replace the word by nature, and then it starts to make more sense to me, you know, so I can still listen to their argument just by replacing one word, because for me a word is not necessarily it doesn't have this, it doesn't need to have the same meaning as somebody that is using this word. That's why I think the language is broken, because how many times will you mean exactly the same thing as the other one that you're talking to will receive by hearing this word? I don't think it's ever like that. So that's why I think that the language needs to be evolved into something way better.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's why I can't be atheist. I don't see how people can completely discount something they can't prove is wrong. And I can see why. I can see how an atheist becomes an atheist when you hear some of the incredible stories coming out of religion, and you look at some of the crimes committed under the guise of religion. You start to hate it. But when people start talking to me about God, I listen until they start speaking as if it were fact. Then I can't listen anymore because I know they don't have the evidence, and that, to me, shows a disconnect from reality. They might imagine it, and if they pre-qualify their statements by saying, look, this is the way I imagine it to be, and then they speak it, I'll listen all day long.
Yeah, but if you, for example, did you listen to the last McKenna bit?
I didn't listen to all of it. I was gone for half of it.
Well, one of the things he kind of says in this whole thing, just to summarize it, is that nobody knows anything, right?
Right.
And what he means is that nobody knows everything. So you can, then he'll just say nobody knows anything. They're just grasping at. But if you then take the stance that if somebody doesn't have evidence for it, and you think that nobody knows the truth, you'd be able to listen to nobody. I mean,
yeah.
It makes sense in your view on reality, right? That you can say, okay, if somebody can't, if they can't bring me evidence, I can't really listen to them. But if McKenna would follow that same rule, he wouldn't be able to listen to anybody.
That's true.
Because he doesn't believe in the evidence. And the same is for me. I mean, I wouldn't be able to listen to anybody if I required proof, which I don't really think exists, you know?
Well, I know what you're saying there, and maybe proof doesn't exist. I'll entertain the concept. But what I think science does more, you see science as something that makes claims that are definitely true. And I see science as something that says, look, this is the closest we can get to known truth. And the reason we can do that is because we can test these hypotheses. And we can't do that with other claims. If we can't test them and show that they have a reliable chance of being certain, then we won't know any kind of truth. So what they're trying to do is say, look, there's a whole sea of information out there. Let's try to get to the good stuff. Maybe there are some realities and some truths here. But I don't see science as being saying, hey, we're science. We have the only truth. Forget everything else. I see science just saying, here are the only known truths we really have. And we only know that because we can prove these things. So I like science more than you do, but it's only because I'm always on the hunt for truth that I can rely on, because there's so much snake oil out there. Do you know that? They're trying to sell you everything. And
oh yeah.
People are vulnerable, very vulnerable to things like faith healers. I was watching a documentary about these faith healers and how they were using, the illegal microphones and headsets and pretending to know people's names. And people were buying this stuff. And we can be fooled very easily. And because we can be fooled so easily, I find a need to have some kind of certainty, at least about the stuff we can prove. So that's why I cling on to science and the scientific method. But unlike a typical scientist, I don't dismiss anything just because it hasn't been proven in a lab. I allow for the whole field of possibility, even if it is a paradox in its statement or proof, to exist out there outside of what I think I know. But this is where you and I differ on science. I give it more. I don't think it's trying to be as dominant as you claim it's trying to be, but I do see it as being pretty solid compared to all the other information that's non-scientific. So where do you think science is making its mistake, and why do you think people that are religious about their science beliefs are making their mistake?
Well, what I was saying earlier that I think that McKenna was getting at is more the fact that the science is based on a really, really small part of reality, but it's making claims as if it's describing the whole of reality, and that's more what I have a problem with. So all things that are not measurable, not seeable, and might only be felt or sensed is kind of a world that I think is really important, and science just pushes aside as, well, we can't measure it, so it's not there,
Well, I think, in my opinion, I think you're getting scientists confused with skeptics. Although one can be the other. Hardcore skeptics say if you can't prove it in a lab, it doesn't exist. Scientists say, I'm going to give something more value as being more likely to be true if I can see that it stands up to the rigorous spotlight of scientific methodology. So I'm with you. There are things we can only feel, barely sense, and we don't know about them. But I think what science says is if you want your information to be included in our group of stuff that we're pushing, it's got to be provable in a lab, and it's got to be repeatable, and it should be able to be an experiment that scientists across the planet can perform and show. And it's very difficult to do that with psychic phenomena or spirituality. Very difficult, because we don't even know what we're talking about yet. I think it's a sense that we're just starting to dabble in now.
Well, it must be, because, if you take the field of science, which is pretty much saying that, 96% is dark matter, which we don't know anything about, so we're focusing on this 4%. For me, it's a bit small to take on a world or even a universal view and put everything in that basket,
Yeah.
For me, it has to, but I agree with you. Just like there are religious people that pretty much spoil it for people that are spiritual, there are also diehard scientists that spoil it for people that do the real science that maybe you and I would prefer.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And it's never good when you hear that scientists are committing fraud